I think the best way to start off is going to be to introduce ourselves. So, my name's Rob Ferguson. I'm the author of Landfill Mountains, and I'm going to be the interviewer today. And if you start off and just begin by sort of telling us as your name and a little bit about your activism, if you'd be okay to.
Cool. I'm Anita Okunde. I'm 17, she, her pronouns. And the activism I specifically look at is centering brown and black and indigenous people at the forefront of the climate movement. It's really important to me because they are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. So it's important that they're centered in any type of solutions we're looking at. I also look at the impact of fast fashion on the climate crisis and how the fashion buying tendencies have a massive effect on the planet. So those are the two areas I specialize in. I work with a national organization, so Fridays for Future Digital, we love, and New Strike Man. So that's where I do the bulk of my activism.
Wonderful. So if you're all right, I'm going to just sort of start leaping into some of the different questions that I've noted down here. So I had a little bit of a search and found out a little bit about your activism beforehand, so that I could come in with from a bit of an informed viewpoint. Something I really liked that you've mentioned from the start there is that it seems that it's quite important for it to be sort of intersectional. It seems important that it's not just about climate change, but it's about how climate change interrelates with issues around race. And I noticed a lot around sort of sex and gender as well, which I thought was it's just so important. In terms of Indigenous cultures, I think something that often gets missed in terms of climate change is people talk about it like it's this future problem. And then when you look at Indigenous people that are suffering now, it's like, well, maybe if we start to talk about it like it's a problem now, then people start actually taking it seriously and start making some changes. Oh, I've lost you. I was right, you fell down a hole.
We're having a bit of a weird thing. Think that
Don't
should be
worry, I've
fine.
still got you. That was terrifying. It was like a pit had opened beneath you. So what I wanted to ask about that is I think, and particularly white people, to be honest, sometimes don't want to talk about race. They want to say, oh, I want to talk about climate change, but I don't want to speak about race. I don't want to speak about how it affects different people differently. I don't want to engage with that topic. And how do you respond when people come at you in that way, I guess?
I think mostly for me, the reason why specifically white people don't want to speak about race when we look at the climate crisis is because of the impact colonialism and white privilege has had on climate movements in the past. If you look at the climate sector right now, it's the second least diverse sector in all the sectors, industries.
Mm.
If you look at conservation and those type of restoration projects, when looking at a better or a climate solution, we see how they disproportionately impact indigenous people and people in the global south in a negative way rather than the positive way
Mm.
they're intended. And that is all just a perpetuation of white privilege and that type of white savior complex that we see a lot in the climate crisis when looking at solutions. And I think that's why it's so uncomfortable for white people to talk about race, because they don't want, when talking about race, you have to acknowledge those problematic kind of conservation projects or those problematic climate solutions that don't include everyone. And by addressing that and saying they're wrong, it takes a lot of steps back. And I think they're not ready to acknowledge that, which I think is why it's so uncomfortable. And I think the conversation in general is uncomfortable. I'm looking at the links between colonialism and the climate crisis and how people view the earth. I think it's always going to be an uncomfortable topic. So I think that's why it's kind of shied away from, but it's still important to speak about it. So I do think it's important that people do take the time to talk about it.
It strikes me in a way that people are almost avoiding the core issue that colonialism slash capitalism, or colonialism and capitalism, however you want to put it, is the cause behind climate change. People almost want to try and maintain, I guess, the cultural status quo, while at the same time saying, we need change in order to make things better, but we don't want to change anything, which can be just such frustrating circular logic. I guess on the same theme around intersectionality, then something else I noticed was that you were really bigging up lots of different female protesters and activists, and I understand that's in some ways a similar question, but I wanted to sort of throw out the question of why is that important?
Yeah, so again, women are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. 80% of women face more of the effects of the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this again is something important to know. A lot of the climate crisis, when we're looking at colonialism, it comes from violence of women.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, have to receive the effects of the climate crisis, which shows how it affects women in a completely different way than it affects men. I think it's really important, again, when looking back at the causes of the climate crisis. Again, colonialism, a lot of violence perpetuated during it, which was predominantly perpetrated by men. And I think, again, it's an uncomfortable topic to look at. But again, it's not one that's noticed as much. I don't think people really make the link between gender and the climate crisis. So I think that's important for me in my activism, to be as intersectional as possible. But I think it's also a lot easier for me to be as intersectional just because I've lived and breathed it. I think there are always interests I was interested in. So I think that was really important to me as a person to kind of get involved and like kind of look at it from those perspectives and are very nuanced angles that people don't genuinely look at the climate crisis from. But I think when we're looking at solutions that are accessible to all and intersectional, it is important that we look at them from these specific angles.
And I'd argue as well that in order to have any kind of solution at all, because if I feel like we've been looking at climate change from a sort of white British or American perspective for quite a long time now, and what you notice is that not much has been changing, and I think you get that privilege maybe of, oh well, things are fine for me right now, so it leads us, I guess, sometimes to quite a lack of action. Something that I was quite interested in asking about, and this I suppose is a personal interest of mine. I'm really interested in how story intersects with climate change. It's why I wrote Land for Mountains. I find the way story links with things really, I guess, important and really powerful. And at the moment, obviously, in terms of climate activism and the way it's responded to it, it sometimes is a bit of a battle of the stories. So you'll get the newspapers and they'll be trying to kind of push this story of, oh, they're just people blocking roads or people doing this, ignoring vast swathes of what activism is anyway, but doing these directed attacks that try and undermine activism. And then on the other side, you've got the activists themselves trying to say, look, this is what's happening to the world. This is the story that needs to be heard. And yeah, I just wondered how important you found sort of storytelling to be in your activism and where it has taken a role.
Yeah, so I think it actually has like a massive part to play, especially when kind of getting the story across to the general public about the climate crisis. I mean, I'm currently reading it, have not finished, but it's great so far. And I think storylines are important, especially not just in books, but in activists telling their stories, in and how they portray activists. And I think it's really important in order to get the general public on the side of like the activists. And I think the stories we've seen recently about Interlake Britain and their protests blocking the M25, and I think the media have used a very precise way of things to ensure that it does cause a bit of frustration. And I do understand that frustration. And I think that's a completely different topic on how we strike and whether it's effective or not, which is something I can rant about for hours. So when looking at specifically how the media affects this and how climate activists telling their story affects this, I think it's important that we listen to them. I think climate activists, a lot of them have such specific, such empowering stories. And I don't think they're shared enough with the media, or they don't have the same platform as the media may have to actually share those stories. And I really think it's important that we amplify their stories and make sure that their voices are heard. I think this is important not only for climate activism, but specifically for other social justice issues which kind of intersect. Again, looking at intersectionality, I think it's important because different climate activists are going to have different stories. There are going to be climate activists that kind of stumbled into it. There are going to be climate activists who are born into it. And I think it's really important that we highlight that and the differences. And I don't think in the media there has been that highlighting of the different activists until recently, which I think is great. But I think beforehand we had a kind of model view of what an activist looked like, you know, someone who eats green, buys all the latest eco-friendly things, predominantly white, predominantly middle class. And I think that view of an activist and putting them in a box, what you think an activist is, has been really problematic for getting new people to join the movement or getting the general public on our side because they don't see someone that looks like them when they see an activist. But B, for actually getting the message about the climate crisis and how sudden and how urgent it is, because people aren't ready to see that when we don't see that in the stories are being reflected in our stories. So not only is storytelling important, but the type of stories we tell is important to actually engage the general public.
It's very helpful for media that's trying to fight against any actual change happening to portray all climate activists as sort of 40-year-old, quite well off, or young and quite well off, Guardian readers. There's a certain way that it's very helpful for them to portray it, and you see that again and again. I think something I noticed as well when I was having a bit of a look on your Instagram was you'd highlighted something around right to protest, which is something that is being threatened in the UK and actually in the US at the moment as well. And I wanted to ask around sort of the importance of protest and what role protest can serve in change making.
I think protests have a large role to serve when looking at change making. I think all we have to look back is historically to see that. I don't think it's something that is new. I think there's a lot of criticism about it right now. But our biggest change is the women's right to vote, the men's right to vote who didn't have land, like the Peterloo Massacre. These have all been protests. And I think protests are the most effective way to bring immediate change. And I see the right to protest being threatened as the right to democracy being threatened. And I don't think that is fair, especially for a government that kind of prides themselves in their kind of liberal democracy. However, saying that, I don't think all ways of protesting are as effective. For example, East Strike Manchester, love East Strike Manchester protests. They are an effective way of protesting. They protest in city centres that kind of raise awareness so that people walk past, but also near government buildings. So it's not an aimless, they're strategic. However, with Insulate Britain, some XR factions, to be specific, the way they protest, it's problematic because A, they affect the lives of those who they need on their side, i.e. working class, minorities. For example, there was a massive XR thing where they dumped a load of cow dung all over the ground. Now, this is problematic because A, where they dumped it didn't actually have any effect on change makers or lawmakers. So the purpose wasn't as important as it should have been. B, the people who are cleaning it up are going to be minimum wage, predominantly ethnic minority kind of workers. And I don't think people look at that when they see protests, especially with a faction of XR's notion of being the arrestables. And again, problematic, just because it kind of looks at the only meaningful protest being arrestable, problematic protesting, which in itself is problematic for ethnic minorities who aren't really in a position to put themselves in that position, number one. And number two, problematic in general because it means that their version of protesting usually disrupts the lives of working class people rather than the people whose lives actually need to be disrupted. For example, the bankers, and the government politicians, the lawmakers. Those are the people we want to kind of speak to and affect, not your local person. Your local person knows that the climate crisis is important and they will support the fact that you believe the climate crisis is important. However, when you start to feed up their time and not the politicians who are meant to be doing something, that's when it becomes problematic. So I think the right to protest shouldn't be threatened. And I think that type of nuance of these climate groups who have kind of disrupted the lives of normal people is how the government's kind of getting people on their side when looking at blocking protests, because they're saying that, oh, look how much they've disrupted you, why would you want them to protest? And I think that's problematic because it disregards every type of protest that isn't that type of protest, and doesn't show the wide variety of protesting and how effective protesting has been, and B, it plays on the feelings of the public in order to kind of get what they want. So it's kind of sneaky. So I do believe that protesting is a human right. It's fundamental to our democracy, and is one of our few ways of communicating direct democracy, so it's really important. However, I think we need to be mindful of how we protest and how effective our protests are going to be for the people who we need to kind of change.
It's scary, the idea that the government would be successfully convincing people to give up their right to protest, because you were given some of the examples of what's been earned through the right to protest, and or through protesting, and obviously votes for everyone that's not white men over the last, and this isn't old history, this is over the last sort of 100-ish years, and even just basic social rights, like men and women being able to marry has only been achieved in the last decade, and all that stemmed from protests. So the idea that people would be being convinced to give up that right is I think quite a scary thing. Something I wanted to ask you around was, so being from your generation, am I right in saying, did you mention at the start that you're 17 years old? So being I wanted to kind of come into what it felt like being a 17-year-old kind of coming into this world, because obviously you've come in and you've immediately seen, oh, this needs changing. I'm going to act. I'm going to take action on it. And I suppose there's two parts to my question really, which is one, how did you get to the place of saying I am going to take action on this, and believing that you could do that, because obviously the journey. And rather than splitting it rather than asking two questions at once, because the other one was going to be about kind of what it feels like being from that generation and looking towards older generations. I'll start off with just that first one of, were there any particular moments that got you into the position of thinking, I believe I can make change and I want to take action, or how did you get to the point of wanting to take action, if that makes sense?
I should probably start off with the fact that the climate crisis wasn't my first type of activism, if that makes sense. That's not how I started. So I think I must have been 11 when I started. 6 years strong. But I looked at racial injustice, which is how I started. I was always quite bright. I think I was lucky with that. And seeing the fact that for kind of my kind of academic level compared to some of my white counterparts, how I was treated and how I felt like things were unfair, that was kind of like my first stance. And because I was so passionate about that, and I've got a big gob, I think I was able to kind of express myself in a way that a lot of people were scared to. And I think that's important for me, and that's kind of my first taste of change. And I think that's really important for me in terms of like building or paving my way to this type of activism, because it taught me that A, hard work pays off, but B, you need to kind of shake things up sometimes to get a bit of change. And then I was a member of Youth Parliament when I was in year 10 or year 9, one of the two. And that was great because I got to work on manifesto points that were specifically important to me. I think I did mental health, knife crime, and work experience. This was my first type of organizational activism where I was doing it with an organization, which was UK Youth Parliament, obviously at the time. I got to do some amazing work and speak to some amazing people. In fact, I think I did a reception at Downing Street for my work on youth violence. again, being able to do that and like kind of be involved in that kind of gave me that type of experience that, oh, it is important for young people to speak up, and it allowed me to amplify the voice of other young people. When looking at how I got involved in the climate crisis, I was always kind of aware of it in the back of my head, but I felt like when I looked up what a climate activist specifically looked like, they didn't look like me, so it wasn't my place. My activism, I'd already kind of boxed myself into the activism I already did and wasn't seeing myself going any further. But then I think I watched a documentary on first how like our clothes are made and how really bad it is for the environment and the impact on fast fashion. And that was the
Mm.
first thing that kind of spurred me on. But then after that, I was also looking at how the global south specifically is affected by the climate crisis and the kind of impacts they have, which we don't see here in the UK, or I lived in Ireland beforehand, so in Ireland, so those impacts weren't as readily seen there. So I thought, oh, maybe that's something interesting. So that's kind of how I started. I was doing some work behind the scenes beforehand, and then during lockdown, I had a bit more free time. So I joined obviously Fridays for Future in Youth Strike Manchester, and it was great being able to join those organisations and help out with some of the work they were doing, which was amazing. So that's kind of how my climate activism started, and I think that's one thing that I think people in my generation have not easier, but the ability to start from like social media or start from the comfort of their own homes, which I think is important because my first kind of initial thing was never to like go to a strike. I found the big fun scary. I found protests scary. So that was never what I intended to start with. So being able to start from the comfort of my own home and like then being able to spread was really great because it gave me flexibility. It allowed me to kind of help at my own kind of level, which is important because I'm 17. Like I've got UCAS applications and university applied to. I mean, at the time I just finished my GCSEs. It's such like a hectic time in terms of not only what's happening in the world, which is a lot, but also in terms of your education, in terms of how you're doing in life, which is why I think eco anxiety is really important to be discussed, and mental health for young activists is really important to be discussed. And I really think people don't acknowledge that sometimes. Like, oh, these really great activists, that yeah, they're doing their part, but they forget their children. um, I shouldn't be 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 having to ask government to do their job. Um, I mean, it's nice that I've been able to like use my voice and stuff and seen changes, but at the same time, government should know that I should be able to like focus on one thing, focus on my academics, or focus on being a child without having to feel compelled to get government to do their job or to take the climate crisis seriously. And I think people kind of forget that. Especially when younger generations didn't really cause the mess that the climate crisis is. We see that it happened a lot from older generations. So why they're meant to fix it all is another thing where I'm like, but I think it's a great time to be alive. The climate crisis hasn't been talked about as much as it is being now, especially from an intersectional level. And also the way we've been able to see other social issues intersect with the climate crisis is really important for young people now who are looking at a lot of information is being shoved to them, a lot of it. And I think being able to kind of link and see the connections is really important. But yeah, I think it's interesting. It's interesting to kind of do that right now.
I can, in terms of the mental health side of it as well, if to be dealing with a global climate crisis, coronavirus, the general impacts and effects of colonialism, to be looking at all those things and trying to hold them in your brain all at the same time, while also just doing school, doing A levels, looking at university. It's just a lot of things to be in the brain at one time, and all topics which have anxiety inducing sides to them. and depressing sides to them as well. So it's I think so important to try and look after your own mental health. But it's also, I think it's difficult to support people to look after their mental health. I come from a mental health background. Difficult to support people to look after mental health nowadays because all these problems are very real as well. They're not problems that can be rationalized away. So they are things that it's very natural to be anxious about, or it's very natural to affect mood because they're a lot of things really difficult ways for the world to be. But there seems something so important in finding hope. And what you talk about there about more people speak about things and more things coming to light, that feels like hope. There was something that is quite key to your activism, from what I can tell, and that you've mentioned a couple of times, is in terms of the fast fashion. I wondered if there's any kind of key message that you'd want to get out there around fast fashion.
I think I'm an economics student, so my big thing is the circular economy, the move to the circular economy. But in terms of fast fashion, I think it's important that we move away from it, but in ways that we don't shame people when moving away from it, which I think has been a really negative thing to come out of fast fashion discourse. We have a lot of activists or people shaming people from buying fast fashion when right now fast fashion is as accessible as it gets. It's online, it has a massive range of sizes, and it's cheap. And I think people seem to forget not everyone has the disposable income to buy slow fashion.
Yeah.
B, slow fashion right now is very limited in sizing. So again, that's another problem. And C, finding brands that are ethical, and when I say ethical, actually ethical, not just say they're ethical. It takes a lot of time and research. When you find them, they're usually really expensive, as they should be, rightly so, because they're paying their workers right and they're using cotton. So when I say move away from fast fashion, my first option isn't slow fashion. I'm not saying go straight to buying slow fashion. What I'm saying is start using more charity shops, thrifting, swapping with friends. Kind of, there's a lot of websites that you can rent dresses now. There's quite a few websites where if at the end of a season, a fast fashion season, those clothes get moved to websites where they're sold really cheaply. I mean, TK Maxx is a big one for designer things, but like for like your normal everyday thing, there are other websites. Flew off the top of my head. But kind of moving towards that when we're looking at buying fashion, just because it's a lot more sustainable for the planet and we're moving to a circular economy because we're reusing things and making sure that they can be reused. And I think it's really important normalizing things like that. Normalizing wearing the same shirt 5 times in a week. Washing machines exist. Using borrowing things off your friend or swapping with your friend. Swap it up, which Zakia runs, does some amazing work with young people in secondary schools and swapping clothes, which we love to see. We've got quite a few charity shops. We've got pronunciation. Us. We have loads that actually now run online shops, which means you don't have to go in person, which was one thing that used to like kill me. I mean, I love the experience of thrifting in person. It's really cool because you kind of have a whole experience and then you get to see things you really like, and if it doesn't fit, that type of thing. But it's so much more convenient online. So this was really important for me to kind of shift to finding kind of thrifting online, which has been great. So I do really think it's important when we're looking at moving away from fast fashion, our brain doesn't automatically flip to go straight to slow fashion because I understand how expensive it is. But what it is looking at different alternatives that allow people to still have access to different clothes or new clothes without actually harming the planet.
It's amazing how much consumerism has, in order to sell us things, convinced us that we need things. Like the idea oh, that'd be a bad thing if someone saw you in the same outfit. Could you imagine, 100, 200 years ago, someone look at someone else and be like, you're wearing the same outfit again? It just wouldn't happen. Whereas somewhere along the line, in order to sell us things, people have convinced us, oh, it's a bad thing if you're seen in the same outfit as you were wearing at another time. I think coming sort of to the end of the interview now, I think what I'd like to ask is there's a lot there's a lot of sort of excitement around younger activists at the moment. I think people are quite eager to hear from young activists and promote their stories, which is really great. But if older people are hearing about some of these younger activists and they're thinking, I want to help, I want to do something positive, are there any first steps that you'd recommend?
I think thing
Help.
the first thing I think is educate yourself. Kind of starting off with that kind of education, reading, listening to podcasts, I guess, before coming into that space is really important because it gets you in the right mindset and it means that young people don't have to reteach you everything, which I think is a big thing we're seeing when, not older people specifically, but, people in general trying to move into the activism space. If you start to educate yourself personally, you don't have to be taught everything by activists. Another thing is kind of have this inner dialogue of why do you want to take part. We've had a lot of adults specifically kind of join youth organizations to try help, but haven't been as efficient or as helpful as they could have been or should have been in the organization. So when you want to join, kind of ask yourself why and whether this is actually going to be benefiting people or whether you'd be better starting something off on your own. So we've got Parents for Future. Love Parents for Future. They do some amazing work and I love seeing their posts on my timeline. And I really think what they do is cool, and they've kind of not made their own brand, but they've, instead of trying to join young people, clearly they've seen they don't fit in that bracket, and they have made Parents for Future, which has created a community for parents who care about their young people who are going to face the climate crisis, and but B, allowed them to be with people their own age and kind of like they relate on a different level than you're going to relate an older person with a younger person. And another thing I say is probably let the young people lead and you follow. I think a lot of times older people come with a lot of wisdom. Very true. And I think it's important that their wisdom is inputted into conversations sometimes. However, I do think the reason why young activists are so kind of interesting to talk to, I guess, or hear their stories is because they have interesting stories and they kind of have a grasp of what they do have a grasp of what they're talking about. And because of that, you need to let them lead in their organizations, in the work they do. If you're coming in as older people, letting young people lead and you following is really important. And I think that's probably one of the most important things when trying to help, because sometimes it can come over as condescending or kind of invading when people come in and they try to like tell you it all when you've been doing it for ages. So I think it's really important that young people lead.
And I think, to be honest, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Is let young people lead, because I think that sums up maybe a way we can start looking at changing the way this world is. And this has just been a wonderful conversation, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly. And I'm pretty certain that anyone who listens through Onway will enjoy it thoroughly as well. I'll get a recording of it. We'll see if we can pop it on YouTube. If possible, we might see if we can pop it somewhere as a podcast, because I think it'd be quite nice just as a chat to listen to as well. Is there anything you'd like to share in terms of where people might find you if they're interested in hearing more from you? Is there any particular social media where you like people to look you up, or any particular cause that has a website you'd like to direct people towards?
My Instagram is probably what I'm most active on, so Anita Okunde. I mean, all my social medias are Anita Okunde on anything. So whatever works. Particular causes. Fridays for Future Digital always. Youth Strike Manchester if you're in Manchester. And Girl at Manchester, which I run. So those are my big causes. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you for having me.